This is Module 4. What determines aggregate supply in the long run and in the short run? There are two types of equilibrium in macroeconomics, one corresponding to the short run and the other corresponding to the long run. The short run in macroeconomics analysis is a period in which wages and some other prices do not respond to changes in economic conditions. In certain markets, as economic conditions change, prices, including wages, may not adjust quickly enough to maintain equilibrium in these markets. A sticky price is a price that is slow to adjust to its equilibrium level, creating sustained periods of shortage or surplus. Wage and price stickiness prevent the economy from achieving its natural level of employment and its potential output. In contrast, the long run in macroeconomics analysis is a period in which wages and prices are flexible. In the long run, employment will move to its natural level and real GDP to potential. An aggregate supply curve depicts the relationship between the price level and the aggregate quantity supplied. Long-run aggregate supply. The long-run aggregate supply, LRAS, curve relates to the level of output produced by firms to the price level in the long run. In the long run, then, the economy can achieve its natural level of employment and potential output at any price level. This conclusion gives us our long-run aggregate supply curve. With only one level of output at any price level, the long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line at the economy's potential level of output. The intersection of the economy's aggregate demand curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve determines its equilibrium in real GDP and price level in the long run. Short-run aggregate supply. In macroeconomics, the short run, a period in which stickiness of wages and prices may prevent the economy from operating at potential output. This explains how deviations of real GDP from potential output can and do occur. For example, some people who were in the labor force but were frictionally or structurally unemployed find work because of the ease of getting jobs at the going nominal wage in such an environment. The result is an economy operating at a higher price level and with output temporarily above potential. As the price level starts to fall, output also falls. The economy finds itself at a price level output combination at which real GDP is below potential. Again, price stickiness is to blame. The prices firms receive are falling with a reduction in demand. Without corresponding reductions in nominal wages, there will be an increase in the real wage. Firms will respond by employing less labor and produce less output. A change in the price level produces a change in the aggregate quantity of goods and services supplied. We distinguish between the long-run aggregate supply curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve when the long-run real GDP equals potential GDP. What determines aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is a measure of the total amount of demand for all finished goods and services produced in an economy. Aggregate demand is commonly expressed as the total amount of money exchanged for those goods and services at a specific price level and point in time. 1. Aggregate demand measures the total amount of demand for all finished goods and services produced in an economy. 2. Aggregate demand is expressed as the total amount of money spent on those goods and services at a specific price level and point in time. 3. Aggregate demand consists of all consumer goods, capital goods, exports, imports, and government spending. Aggregate demand is a macroeconomics term and can be compared to the gross domestic product, GDP. GDP represents the total amount of goods and services produced in an economy, while aggregate demand is the demand or desire for those goods. Aggregate demand and GDP commonly increase or decrease together. Aggregate demand equals GDP only in the long run after adjusting for the price level. Short-run aggregate demand measures total output for a single nominal price level without adjusting for inflation. Aggregate demand consists of all consumer goods, capital goods, exports, imports, and government spending programs. All variables are considered equal if they trade at the same market value. What affects aggregate demand? 1. Interest rates. 2. Income and wealth. 3. Currency exchange rates. 4. Economic conditions. Aggregate demand is a concept of macroeconomics that represents the total demand within an economy for all kinds of goods and services at a certain price point. In the long term, aggregate demand is indistinguishable from GDP. However, aggregate demand is not a perfect metric, and it is a subject of debate among economists. Real GDP and the price level, what causes growth, inflation, and cycles. To determine whether the economy of a nation is growing or shrinking in size, economists use a measure of total output called real GDP. Real GDP, short for Real Gross Domestic Product, is the total value of all final goods and services produced during a particular year or period, adjusted to eliminate effects of changes in prices. The purpose of this measurement is to determine whether the economy's output is growing or shrinking. If each final good or service produced, from hammers to haircuts, were valued at its current market price, and then we were to add the values of all such items produced, we would not know if the total had changed because output changed, or because prices changed, or both. The market value of all final goods and services produced can rise even if total output falls. To isolate the behavior of total output only, we must hold prices constant at some level. For example, if we measure the value of basketball output over time using a fixed price for valuing the basketballs, then only an increase in the number of basketballs produced could increase the value of the contribution made by basketballs to total output. By making such an adjustment for basketballs and all other goods and services, we obtain a value for real GDP. Phases of the business cycle shows that economies go through periods of increasing and decreasing real GDP, but that over time, they generally move in the direction of increasing levels of real GDP. A sustained period in which real GDP is rising is an expansion. A sustained period in which real GDP is falling is a recession. Typically, an economy is said to be in a recession when real GDP drops for 2 consecutive quarters. The point at which an expansion ends and a recession begins is called the peak of the business cycle. Real GDP then falls during a period of recession. Eventually, it starts upward again. The point at which a recession ends and an expansion begins is called the trough of the business cycle. The expansion continues until another peak is reached. A complete business cycle is defined by the passage from one peak to the next. The main schools of thought in macroeconomics today. As the term implies, macroeconomics is a field of study that analyzes an economy through a wide lens. This includes looking at variables like unemployment, GDP, and inflation. In addition, macroeconomists develop models explaining the relationships between these factors. The field of macroeconomics is organized into many different schools of thought, with differing views on how the markets and their participants operate. Classical economists held that prices, wages, and rates are flexible and markets tend to clear unless prevented from doing so by government policy, building on Adam Smith's original theories. The term classical economist is not actually a school of macroeconomic thought, but a label applied first by Karl Marx and later by Keynes to denote previous economic thinkers with whom they respectively disagreed. Keynesian economics was founded mainly based on the works of John Maynard Keynes and was the beginning of macroeconomics as a separate area of study from microeconomics. Keynesians focused on aggregate demand as the principal factor in issues like unemployment and the business cycle. Keynesian economists believe that the business cycle can be managed by active government intervention through fiscal policy, where governments spend more in recessions to stimulate demand or spend less in expansions to decrease it. They also believe in monetary policy, where a central bank stimulates lending with lower rates or restricts it with higher ones. According to the Keynesian theory, the typical firm does not change its prices immediately when aggregate demand fluctuates. Monetarist. The monetarist school is a branch of Keynesian economics credited mainly with the works of Milton Friedman. Working within and extending Keynesian models, monetarists argue that monetary policy is generally a more effective and desirable policy tool to manage aggregate demand than fiscal policy. However, monetarists also acknowledge limits to monetary policy that make fine-tuning the economy ill-advised and instead to prefer adherence to policy rules that promote stable inflation rates. New Classical. The New Classical School, along with the New Keynesians, is mainly built on integrating microeconomics foundations into macroeconomics to resolve the glaring theoretical contradictions between the two subjects. The New Classical School emphasizes the importance of microeconomics and models based on that behavior. The New Classical economists assume that all agents try to maximize their utility and have rational expectations, which they incorporate into macroeconomic models. New Classical economists believe that unemployment is largely voluntary and that discretionary fiscal policy destabilizes, while inflation can be controlled with monetary policy. New Keynesian. The New Keynesian school also attempts to add microeconomic foundations to traditional Keynesian economic theories. While New Keynesians accept that households and firms operate based on rational expectations, they still maintain that there are a variety of market failures, including sticky prices and wages. Because of this stickiness, the government can improve macroeconomic conditions through fiscal and monetary policy. Austrian. The Austrian school is an older school of economics that is seeing some resurgence in popularity. Austrian economic theories mainly apply to microeconomic phenomena. However, they, like the so-called classical economists, never strictly separated micro and macroeconomics. Austrian theories also have important implications for what is otherwise considered macroeconomic subjects. In particular, the Austrian business cycle theory explains broadly synchronized macroeconomic swings in economic activity across markets due to monetary policy and the role that money and banking play in linking microeconomic markets to each other and across time. How expenditure plans are determined when the price level is fixed. The consumption function relates the level of consumption in a period to the level of disposable income in that period. The equilibrium real GDP of the aggregate expenditures model is determined at a given price level. This model relates aggregate expenditures, which equal the sum of planned levels of consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports at a given price level to the level of real GDP. People, firms, and government agencies may not always spend what they had planned to spend. If so, then actual real GDP will not be the same as aggregate expenditures, and the economy will not be at the equilibrium level of real GDP. When expenditure plans are equal to real GDP, there is equilibrium. Real GDP is a measure of the total output of firms. Aggregate expenditures equal total planned spending on that output. Equilibrium in this model occurs where aggregate expenditures in some period equal real GDP in that period. One way to think about equilibrium is to recognize that firms, except for some inventory that they plan to hold, produce goods and services with the intention of selling them. Aggregate expenditures consist of what people, firms, and government agencies plan to spend. If the economy is at its equilibrium real GDP, then firms are selling what they plan to sell. That is, there are no unplanned changes in inventories. Each level of real GDP will result in a particular number of aggregate expenditures. If aggregate expenditures are less than the level of real GDP, firms will reduce their output and real GDP will fall. If aggregate expenditures exceed real GDP, then firms will increase their output and real GDP will rise. If aggregate expenditures equal real GDP, then firms will leave their output unchanged. We have achieved equilibrium in the aggregate expenditures model. At equilibrium, there is no unplanned investment. Planned savings equals disposable income minus planned consumption expenditure. How real GDP is determined when the price level is fixed. Real gross domestic product, GDP, is an inflation-adjusted measure that reflects the value of all goods and services produced by an economy in a given year. Real GDP is expressed in base year prices. Real GDP tracks the total value of goods and services calculating the quantities but using constant fixed prices that are adjusted for inflation. This is opposed to nominal GDP, which does not account for inflation. Adjusting for constant prices makes it a measure of real economic output for apples-to-apples comparison over time and between countries. 1. real gross domestic product is an inflation-adjusted measure that reflects the value of all goods and services produced by an economy in a given year. 2. It is expressed in base year prices and is often referred to as constant price, inflation-corrected, or constant dollar GDP. 3. Real GDP makes comparing GDP more meaningful because it shows comparisons for both the quantity and value of goods and services. 4. Real GDP is calculated by dividing nominal GDP by a GDP deflator. 5. Unlike real GDP, nominal GDP uses current market prices and doesn't factor inflation into its calculation. Real GDP is a macroeconomic statistic that measures the value of the goods and services produced by an economy in a specific period, adjusted for price changes. Essentially, it measures a country's total economic output taking price changes into account, whether they are due to inflation or deflation. Governments rely on both real and nominal GDP to get an idea of where the economy is heading. While real GDP takes inflation or deflation into account, nominal GDP is a macroeconomic assessment of the value of goods and services using current prices in its measure. Expenditure multiplier. Keynesian economics believe that the level of economic activity is driven in the short term by changes in aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. Suppose that the macro equilibrium in an economy occurs at the potential GDP, so the economy is operating at full employment. Keynes pointed out that even though the economy starts at potential GDP, because aggregate demand tends to bounce around, it is unlikely that the economy will stay at potential. The reason is that a change in aggregate expenditures circles through the economy. Households buy from firms. Firms pay workers and suppliers. Workers and suppliers buy goods from other firms. Those firms pay their workers and suppliers, and so on. In this way, the original change in aggregate expenditures is actually spent more than once. This is called the expenditure multiplier effect. An initial increase in spending cycles repeatedly through the economy and has a larger impact than the initial dollar amount spent. An increase in the marginal propensity to consume makes the multiplier larger. Suppose governments spontaneously purchase $100 billion worth of goods and services, perhaps because they feel optimistic about the future. The producers of those goods and services see an increase in income by that amount. They use that income to pay their bills, paying wages and salaries to their workers, rent to their landlords, payments for the raw materials they use. Any income left over is profit, which becomes income to their stockholders. Each of these economic agents takes their new income and spends some of it. Those purchases then become new income to the sellers, who then turn around and spend a portion of it. This process continues, though because economic agents spend only part of their income, the numbers get smaller in each round. When the dust settles, the amount of new income generated is multiple times the initial increase in spending, hence the name the spending multiplier. The relationship between aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand. Aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand are macroeconomic concepts that estimate two variants of the same value, national income. In the subspecialty deemed national income accounting, the market value of all products and services is summed to estimate gross national income, the aggregate wealth produced by the country. Both aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand take consumption, investment, government outlays, and net factor income from abroad as the basic components of economic demand. When the economy is in equilibrium, spending levels on consumption, investment, government outlays, and net factor income from abroad equate to total effective demand, and therefore the value of all goods and services supplied by the economy. An increase in real GDP leads to an increase in aggregate planned expenditure. Inflation reduces the volume of goods and services transacted. Much the same thing happens to aggregate expenditure because its components are nearly similar. The key difference is that the aggregate expenditure side of national income accounting breaks out planned and unplanned investment.